Hello. So I'm so grateful, Francis, that this is a yes for you, and I look forward to this our second conversation now. I as I shared with you before, your work, your writing, such as something immense and vast in me, um, and and in our first conversation also just I so deeply enjoyed just being with you for this time and being in this conversation. And a lot of my friends have shared our episode with their communities, and our the things that you shared, again, that they touch something vast and immense in people.
Mm,
And so I feel a great honor to help share you and your work with others.
thank you, Brian.
So,
Much appreciated.
um, my intention for today is to talk a lot less than I did the first time. Um, I At the same time, I feel my heart beating. I feel again that sort of nervousness of, wow, how do we approach this? And for me, as a you know as a man aware that I lack the presence of elders, true elders in my world, being able to sit with you for a time is it feels like something that should happen regularly, and yet it is so rare that I feel the nervousness of that, and the
Mm,
so again, thank you
mm,
for being here, saying
you're
yes to this
welcome.
conversation.
You're welcome.
I want to start with a quote you wrote in your book. Well, you wrote in your book. It wasn't a quote until you wrote it. Now it's a quote.
Okay.
That actually another man, one of my men's groups, picked out. And I want to start with that to kick us off today. It is those who undertake the full journey into their grief come back carrying medicine for the world. My hope today, Francis, for our conversation is that I know that I am on the precipice of this journey into grief in a way that I've never really embarked upon before. And my hope for our conversation today is that even both certainly myself, but also those who are listening, we can come away from this with kind of two things. One, a better understanding of why this journey matters, not as just like a one-time thing we do, but why a regular practice of I don't know, grief work or sorrow, attending to sorrow, apprenticing with sorrow is important. And two, what it could look like to actually begin to host regular, living community rituals in our own homes. Um, because I'm eager for that, and I also feel a lot of fear. I feel afraid at the
Hmm.
precipice of that. I'm ready to do it, and I feel fear.
That's wise.
So let's start there. Um, what are we talking about, right? Come back carrying medicine for the world.
This is a very old thought that when you're particularly in a state of acute grief, when something near and dear to you has left, died, however it's been changed and transformed in you, you leave the ordinary world. You leave the daylit world of work, and I mean, you might still have to go to work because we are so inhospitable to grief
Mm,
and its customs and its requirements on us. But on some level, you're not walking in the daylit world anymore. You've begun a sojourn into the underworld. And in many traditional cultures, there's a recognition that you've left and that you're doing some kind of deep work that can only happen, or that happens only in the dark, in that territory of sightlessness and um, solitude. And so what happens in that place is you are being remade by grief. You are being, in a sense, disassembled. I mean, anybody who's gone through acute grief knows that things just fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, you don't know which way to walk. You don't know how to brush your teeth. You don't know how to stay in friendship. You don't know how to do anything. Nothing makes sense.
Mm.
Because that ordinary world, again, has been basically severed. Now, the work that happens in the darkness is one of being, I want to be, it's not just an endurance test down there. How do I get by? How do I get out of here?
Yeah.
But it's really engaging that material. See, grief doesn't just want to be endured, it wants to be engaged. So we work the grief. We write it, we dance it, we put it into ritual, we draw it, we find ways of giving it shape and texture and form. And in that process, some alchemy occurs where the grief and the soul kind of fuse into a more into a spaciousness more capable of recognizing our deep interaction with the whole of the world. So what grief really teaches us is that we're inseparable
Mm.
from one another and from the anima mundi, the soul of the world. We're tangled up with all of it. It's only our kind of Western individualistic notions that give us this fiction that we're separate from it.
Mm.
But what happens again when that grief takes hold and works us deeply, we are being remade in that process and deepened
Mm.
and ripened by the heat of grief. And when we return, if we're really allowed the full full time in that place of depth and descent, we come back different. We
Mhm.
come back more capable of recognizing your sorrows and their sorrows and the earth's sorrows. And we come back, in a sense, with a greater capacity to address, to respond, to stay open to the sorrows of the world. And that's what
Mm.
we need right now. We need human beings capable of staying open to what is happening. Otherwise, if we don't register what's going on, who will? So I don't think grief is just about again me resolving something,
Yeah.
but being dissolved into something.
You quote Stephen Jenkinson. I think he was a biologist. I can't remember exactly his title, or his work. But in your book, you quote him. He says, "Hold your sorrow to a degree of eloquence whereby everyone around you will be fed by your efforts to do so."
Mm-hmm.
Again, just there's a vastness in that, in those words, in that stance, I suppose. I have a friend right now whose father just passed, and they knew it was coming. It wasn't a surprise. Um, and my friend, who's just turned 40, he told me in the days following. He said, "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do."
Mm-hmm.
This is a man, like, he literally doesn't know what to do with himself. He has a small child, but he doesn't know what to do. And he's even his Jewish faith isn't really helping him find his way. I know there's rituals and certain practices in the Jewish faith, certainly more than what I would be supported by as a,
Mm-hmm.
not really a religious practitioner. And so I'm like, he's suffering the obvious loss of the death of his father, and he doesn't know what to do. And I'm also, mindful of just and you write about this as well. And I look at my life, like, there's nothing obvious for me to grieve, but I don't know what to do either.
Well, that's part of our cultural fiction is doing.
Uh,
Grief stops us.
mm,
We feel immobile, like,
mm,
but we keep framing it. I think particularly for men, we keep framing it. I should be doing something about
mm,
this,
mm, mm,
rather than being with it
mhm,
and being educated by it,
mm,
being broken open.
mm,
I mean, this is heart work.
mm.
And if we don't know how to be with that tremendous sorrow, I mean, your friend's grief is because he loved his father,
Hmm.
and grief and love are have been entangled since the beginning. There is no grief that's not connected to the loss of love, and there's no love that does not have grief latent within it. Everything we love, we will lose.
Mm.
Everything, either by their disappearance or ours. So this thing about doing, I'm glad he doesn't know what to do, because that is really what's required, is a certain
Mm.
pausing, a certain stopping, a certain dropping into silence and solitude. Even though I speak about community all the time around grief
Hmm.
work, and we will talk about that, I'm sure, today,
Hmm.
there is a certain hospitality that we're asked to provide to grief, which is about silence and solitude. Can we slow down enough to become attuned to the voice of grief, to the subtle whispers of grief, sometimes the loud cries of grief that we can drown out through anesthesia and distraction and
Hmm.
doing.
Yeah.
And there's nothing wrong with doing, but it tends to preoccupy so much of our psychic lives. And so there's a requirement in grief work of being able to slow down and drop down. And it's like when we go into that underworld space, as I've said, it's more like crawling
Mm.
and brailing.
Hmm.
We can't see, so we don't know what to do. But we can sense and we can feel and we can caress and we can be touched by the atmosphere in the dark, and the whispers that come out of the dark. And that's really what we have to do. And that's also so damn uncomfortable,
Yeah.
because we think we should be able to, you know, do something and somehow then alleviate the weightiness and the gravity of where we've just been taken.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned there the first gate of grief, everything we love we will lose. And you write in your book Wild Edge of Sorrow that grief is akin to praise. It is how the soul recounts the depth to which someone has touched our lives. To love is to accept the rights of grief.
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
that's fierce, isn't it?
Hmm.
It's a fierce thing to really open our heart to loving another, whatever that other is, whether it's an animal or a place or a home or a partner or a friendship. On some level, we know this isn't going to last.
Mm.
This has a termination date. Again, either through my disappearance, my death, or theirs, or the house is sold, or beloved animal friends die. Uh, there's no way to negate this truth. And so we either kind of shroud the heart and remain somewhat aloof,
Hmm.
and we love kind of carefully and cautiously, which is understandable,
Hmm.
partly because we're not taught anything about grief. And second of all, most of us are being told to have to face our grief alone,
Mm.
which is overwhelming.
Yeah.
We can't do it alone. Grief has always been communal. It has never been a private affair until now.
Yeah.
Sometimes the best we can do is talk to a private practice therapist,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know. And what you just also mentioned, Bryan, about you don't have any identifiable griefs, but you don't know what to do either. You know,
And I've learned recently to identify. Actually, there's a lot of identifiable
there's a
grief.
lot of grief around us.
And
Yeah.
even still, I don't know what to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Learn that's part of the apprenticeship, is learning how to develop an ongoing intimacy with sorrow.
Mm.
Come into companionship with it. I mean, if you had a friend who was you wouldn't try to do something. You would be with it.
Yeah.
You would sit and just listen. You would hold a prolonged vigil for that friend. Well, what if the friend is you and the companion you're sitting with is grief, who's going to be there almost every single day of your life? There's no real attention to the world without feeling some of that. How can you listen to any of the news? How can you
Mm.
read anything online, or if we still read newspapers, which is part of our grief? Uh, how could we even drive to work with roadkill on the side of the roads or homeless encampments? And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
it's impossible to not be, you know, touched by sorrow, by grief. And again, if you're forced to carry it alone and face that alone, all praise to your heart for shutting down.
Yeah.
Numbness, I don't have any judgment about numbness. I think
Mm-hmm.
thank God the psyche can do that, because if you're alone with all this, it would just, the weight of it would just crush you. So we need friendship and community around our grief, our walk with grief.
Yeah, my friend shared with me that his community, a number of his friends, when they would reach out to him in the days following, would ask him, um, "What can we do? Let us know if we can do anything." And he shared with me that, like, I don't have an answer to that. I
Well,
don't.
the question's backwards.
Yeah.
You know, in a sense, if we had any familiarity with grief, we would know what he needs.
Mm-hmm.
You know, bring him some food, sit
Mm-hmm.
with him, even in silence. You know, bring some flowers over to the house. You know, just send him a quick message. I'm just holding you, brother.
Yeah.
You know, you're not alone with this. But because we don't, we put it back on the person in grief to somehow give us our assignments.
Our
And
marching orders
yeah,
to
yeah,
do something to help you through it,
yeah,
to help you get through it as quick as possible.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But that's part of our learning is how, what does grief require of any human being?
Yeah, I see that my wife, we were living in Los Angeles well, she lived there for 34 years, and homeless encampments, and they're not unusual. We encountered them daily, especially in the last couple of years, and we've now relocated to a new city, and still, there are people without homes on the corners. We pull up to a light with signs, and I can feel that part of me that just wants to shut down and say, well, that's everywhere, and it's not. I just can't pay attention to it constantly. And my wife, who lives, she feels everything acutely, is a reminder to me constantly of the pain of this. And I've learned, having been with her for 6 years now, not to tell her to not feel something. I mean, I still may at times, in my ignorance and moment of blindness, do that
Mm-hmm.
because I don't want to feel it. And I think, again, she's a great reminder to me, a great presence, a great gift to me, that there there is still, oh, heartbreak daily. And this is, I think, Francis, this is what I'm really curious to explore. As again, it's one thing for my friend just lost his father, but what about all of us? My wife, who hurts when we pull up to a stoplight and someone has a sign begging for food, asking for food. What about my friends that, even I shared with you at the beginning of this conversation, I'm a group of friends, and I, very, very close male friends in my men's group, are actually, we're in a pretty heavy conversation around the content of vaccines, and the trucker protests up in Canada, and what it all means. And we have a lot of different um, ideas and stories and perspectives around this. And one of the things that I just shared in the last couple of days with these men is, as I kind of put my sword down for a minute, I just said, I'm scared. I'm really afraid. I feel a lot of fear when these conversations come up, and the fear has so many layers to it. And I also realize underneath all of that is a profound grief. I mean, the layers of it, Francis, are just. I mean, I'm grieving my father inside of this, whose ideas I was never able to bridge to. I'm grieving the future ideas of where we're headed, where this is all bringing us in the future. I'm grieving
Mhm.
the present, the disconnect in families. I mean, how do I then? What I really would like to explore too is how do I bring community together rather than I feel like we're just fighting over so much content that's we're avoiding or not aware of or not paying attention to or not talking about the mountains of sadness and pain and fear underneath, and instead sort of rising up in arms, hoping that if I just win you over to my idea of or vanquish your position, then I'll feel better and all will be well again. And that's clearly not working.
No, no, it's not working at all. And that's part of the remnant of what we don't acknowledge, which is the void of community and the
Hmm.
commons of the soul. Because, like you say, underneath the vitriol and the positioning is a profound fear and a profound sense of erosion, of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Things are in decay, and every psyche, I think, on the planet has some sense of that is happening, whether it's through
Hmm.
environmental issues, collapses of ecosystems, water rising. And here in California, we haven't had rain all year so far since January,
Mm-hmm.
and temperatures up in the close to 80 degrees. And uh, this is not boding well. So you can feel it already coming up. Fire season's coming in. And I'm thinking about that in February,
Mm-hmm.
so we feel it. But what do we do with it? Well, one of the protections against it is kind of that uh, positioning of a defense around who's wrong. And but if we could begin to drop below those positions, what we would meet in is that deep, deep well of sorrow.
Mm-hmm.
And in that space, we recognize our commonality. We are living and sharing a lot of despair, hopelessness, loss. I just finished writing the preface for a book by Dwayne Elgin called Choosing Earth, which I think is out now.
Great. I remember you talking about this last time.
Yeah, one of the things I said in there is that, grief will be the keynote for the coming generation. It could be 10, 20, 30 years,
Mm.
and grief is going to be the keynote. So that doesn't mean to be said in a depressing way, but it means, in a sense, how do we prepare ourselves to stay open to life? Because if we don't, then it's already a done game.
Mm.
So we are being fiercely ripened, hopefully, during these coming decades
Mm.
to take our place in the world from the dominator role to a participant in this profound cosmic dance of life.
Yeah.
It may not exist anyplace else. We don't know.
Yeah.
But what if this is the only one?
Yeah.
How are we going to tend to this? So becoming fluid in the customs of grief, how do we attend to that? How do I um, ongoingly come to the shrine of grief, both in my inner life, but also in my community,
Mm-hmm.
so that my heart does not become congested by so much despair that my capacity to respond to the world basically shuts off.
Yeah.
That's the real danger.
So this is what I'd like to get at. Rumi said the wound is where the light enters us. I mean, throughout your book and your work, that the immensity that, as I said, your writing touches in me. I I feel an aliveness. I believe I'm 47. I'm proud of the life I've cultivated. I feel I've cultivated a rich and interesting experience in my 47 years. And I feel there is an immensity that I haven't really touched, and I feel that the grief and sorrow is the gateway to that, and that blows my mind to even be saying that because of the culture I live in, right? The
Mhm.
heroic culture. And so, how do I begin? I'm a novice. I know most of my listeners are going to be novices at this. How do we begin right here in our homes to to bring community together without needing someone to die, something obvious to do this work?
Mhm. Mhm.
I had an experience recently, Francis, that blew my mind. I was so confused by it. What, I don't remember if we spoke about this, if I shared this with you, but it was where my stepmother was on an incubator, not an incubator, ventilator. Incubators, I think that's what they put chicks on, little baby
Mhm.
chicks. No, this was she was on a ventilator, had COVID, and 50-50 shot she's going to live. My stepmother. Now, there's a big story here, a lot of history, and it involves my father and all this stuff. And there was a brief moment where I got my father back in a way because because her life, in a way, he and I got to connect in a way we hadn't in years. And she didn't die. She made it off the ventilator. Now, naturally, I'm thrilled, but I also noticed, Francis, I was actually angry. I wasn't angry that she lived. Of course not. I feel horrible even saying,
Mhm.
acknowledging that I had this very strange experience. But I had a sense that there was a number of things at play, and one of them was just part of it is like I was angry that I didn't get to grieve. Like part of me wants to go there so badly. I want to feel and cry and shake and be deranged as you speak about through this process, and so tightly held together. And again, I love my life. I have a beautiful life, all these things, but like, how do we begin to get at this without needing something big to happen? How can I begin to cultivate this, create this in this weekend, next week, today? I don't know, but how do I do this?
Well, as I mentioned in the book, that these other four gates are right there.
Mm-hmm.
They're swirling around us all the time.
Mm,
Parts of us that haven't known love, the sorrows of the world, the absence of the village and the community and the ancestral grief. Pay attention. Start to notice the ways in which you carry grief. Begin a courtship with grief, in other words. And you can find, and
mm,
I think any given day, like I said earlier, you're being affected by loss and by
mm-hmm.
sorrow. You know, every day you will be immersed in that place. I'm not saying to live a life obsessed with grief, but to become hospitable and receptive to grief when it comes to you.
Mm,
And that's not an easy thing to do. So, while you're cultivating this relationship with grief, you're also nourishing the heart through beauty, through friendship,
mm,
through the erotic. Uh, there's ways in which you can consistently keep the heart open and receptive to sorrow. That's part of our work, is to continuously create the conditions under which we can be receptive to the joys and sorrows of the world simultaneously.
mm-hmm.
Simultaneously.
So if I want to, like, I really want to enter this work consciously and intentionally, and part of me is thinks, okay, so next time I'm driving with my wife and we pull up and there's a person standing there with a sign, I can feel the part of me that wants to, I don't really turn away. I don't, want to ignore people, but will often acknowledge, maybe wave. But there's part of me that closes my heart at the same time. I feel that part of me. It's like, oh, I can't deal with this. And my wife goes there. She wants to pull out her purse. She wants to looks around the car. What do we have? She utters some words about of her heartbreak, and so part of me, I think a practice I can take on is to turn into it, even with my wife, sit there and acknowledge the sadness and the pain
Hmm.
the awfulness of this moment.
Yeah, and you also need to have compassion for the part of you that wants to turn away.
Hmm.
Because if we begin to judge that, that's another way the heart closes.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been conditioned to avoid, to turn away,
Hmm.
to stay in that sunny, positive terrain of the hero.
Right, right.
So there is a reluctance, there's a hesitation.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to touch that hesitation with the softest hands possible. No judgment about it. Oh, I'm turning away. Ah, that scares me. Ah, that's too much. Oh, I'm too alone with this.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, that's the softening, the membrane between you and the homeless person, or the clear cut in the
Mm-hmm.
forest.
Mm-hmm.
That membrane has to become thinner and thinner and more porous. And that is a courageous thing to do in a culture that is steeped in amnesia and anesthesia. We forget how entangled we are with everything. And then we top that forgetfulness off with a lot of distraction, alcohol, drugs, porn, everything. With
Right.
entire industries devoted to.
I'm driving. I got to focus on the light. I'm driving. I got to get us where we're going.
Yeah.
That's simple.
So can we hold that hesitation with kindness and warmth? See, the thing about grief is that it needs to be kept warm in order for it to move. That's the old alchemical idea, is
Mm.
that whatever it is that's caught our attention, whatever it is that's affecting us with sorrow, my core job is to keep that material warm so we can move. When we turn
Mm.
away from it,
Mm.
or when we try to fix it, there's something that turns that material cold. And when it turns cold, it hardens and congeals, and then there's no movement. So then that's when my heart becomes congested. And our number one cause of death in the culture is congestive heart failure.
Mm.
And it isn't just French fries and
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
meat.
Yeah.
It's the congestion in our hearts is very literally our undigested grief. So we have to keep it warm. We have to keep turning toward it and softening the places around it so that we can stay present
Mm.
and ask for support. Again, not doing this by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What do you need to keep this place warm? Well, friendship and kindness and, shared words of honoring and acknowledging the fact that this is too hard right now. There's too much. Our psyches aren't meant for this much material on any given day.
Mm.
We have been designed over, several 100,000 years, million years to take in what is local. In my watershed,
Mm.
someone might have fallen and broken a leg, or a child might have died from some illness or something. We're capable of processing that locally and usually communally. But now I'm 24/7 saturated by, an information flow that just tells me that without reprieve,
Mm-hmm.
that there's anything out there that's helpful or hopeful,
Mm.
or the only news we hear is basically what is fucked up.
Yeah.
So we need to also be able to see the kindnesses and care and compassion of others, and drink and drink and drink beauty. That is an unmistakable need of the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In the spirit of keeping it warm, keeping the grief warm, I want to, again, I think you really lit this up in me, the need for this. And I mean, you talked about, you've spent time with various peoples in other cultures and in Africa and more traditional ancient cultures, and they would have regular weekly rituals s- within which the community came together to touch sorrow. I mean, that's
Hmm.
I'm I feel like I'm literally dying to create that again. To it's one of the gates of grief, that which we expected we did not receive. I
Yeah.
expected this. I expected community to rally. I expected the village. I remember I started working alone. Maybe I'm 47. When did I really start working alone? Like maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. That was one of the most painful things I've ever been through. Coming out of a workplace into working by myself at home. One of the most excruciating experiences. I mean, everyone lauded it. It was such the greatest thing. You get to be in charge of your schedule. Oh, there's all this. Anyway, it was so difficult for me.
Mm.
And anyway, I'm so attuned to that grief, and I feel the deep desire to create living community again. It's part of the reason my wife and I had left Los Angeles to come where we are now, because I was really struggling in the sprawl of that city to have community there. And so I think I shared this with you in my last conversation, that I told my friends I want to start having monthly, and I don't know what to call it, but I want to, some type of sorrow ritual, a grief and sorrow ritual, regular monthly. Can you help me? What could that look like? How could I do that in a way that would be accessible even to, again, my friends that might think, well, nobody died, so I don't need to go to that.
Well, I think just the invitation is powerful because
Hmm.
that's what we're waiting for it some days.
Hmm.
When we put our announcements out about the grief ritual, they fill within
Mm.
sometimes within hours. Uh,
It's amazing what we think people don't want.
well, yeah,
They're
but
dying,
that's
they're craving.
yeah, absolutely. Because I
Yeah.
think the denial level is
Yeah.
absolutely been crushed.
Yeah.
We can't deny what's going on in our culture and in
Yeah.
our communities and in our ecosystems. There's no denial. I mean,
Yeah.
you can try it, but so what can you do? Well, extend the invitation saying, on Friday night, we're gathering to talk about loss.
Hmm.
However, it shows up at your door. you know, And
Mm.
the only proviso is that we don't try to fix it.
Mm.
We don't try to give advice to anybody.
Hmm.
We don't try to make it better.
Hmm.
We really become, a containment field for the sorrows personally and collectively that are swirling around each of our souls.
Hmm.
It doesn't have to be complicated either. Maybe you say a poem at the beginning, or light a candle and then, but make space around everyone's share. And you can do simple rituals. I've offered a couple rituals in the back of my book, and the
Hmm.
stone ritual is a very
Hmm.
poignant ritual. And what I love about doing ritual together is that you begin to see this is not my grief. This is our grief. I may not have the exact shape of grief that you have. Maybe I don't know about suicides, or maybe I don't know about, a child dying, but I do know the space you're in.
Mm.
And that's ours to carry. I mean, again, that loss of the village means it's up to me to carry it. That's not going to work. I mean, that's why people come over and over and over again to the grief rituals, is that this is the place where they can feel for a while that we are in shared territory and the commons of the soul are being attended. that we all know loss. Every person you see walking down the street is a carrier of loss.
Hmm.
And if we don't tend to that, that's when we become hardened to each other, to the biosphere. So this is not just good hygiene to keep moving the grief.
Hmm.
It's also soul activism. This keeps us entangled on a deep, deep level with the soul of the world, how it shows up.
Hmm.
So it doesn't have to be a complicated thing, Bryan. You can, and even if people like your men's circle, even if they're afraid, if they hear one person say honest words about loss, it touches them, it moves them. And it's not like every person's going to grieve that day, but that's the idea of the communal cup of grief, is that if one of us grieves, one of us shares sorrow or tears, all of us will feel different by it. And I've seen that 1,000 times in rituals. You know, I often say we have to learn how to think like a village during our time together this weekend.
Hmm.
You may not grieve when we get to the time, but that's also the wisdom of ritual, is that you do it again and again and again and again. Eventually, you're going to be the one on the floor. But in the meantime,
Yeah.
you get to be the one supporting the others who have gone to the floor. And I guarantee you will feel different when you leave this place, whether
Hmm.
you wept personally or not, because that's that fourth gate. We remember what it's like to be in communal space. I can't tell you how many times someone will say after the end of the weekend, saying, I've never done anything like this before in my life,
Hmm.
but it felt oddly familiar. This is the deep structure of our soul expected this. This was the setting it anticipated. I wasn't going to be condemned to solitary confinement with my grief. I was actually meant to be in this kind of space, to sing together, to weep together, to share dreams together, to eat together, to dance together, to laugh together. When we get close to the end of the ritual, there is this shift in the atmosphere. Joy comes in the room. As our hearts feel less burdened, as they feel more spacious, we begin to remember that we also know joy. And it's infectious.
Yeah.
It's gorgeous. It's just beautiful.
Now I know this is something that I'm just gonna have to experiment with, dive in and experiment with, and find my way, and understanding beautifully, so that my community we will find our way together. This isn't
Yeah.
just for me to create. This is that we create this together. And but as I'm again, and I imagine a lot of people listening are just at the precipice of this. Some of our listeners will have never even imagined doing anything like this. This is the first time they're hearing of it, and it's my hope that likewise there's a spark, or a a pilot light that is sort of being turned up a little bit right now in people. It certainly has been in me, particularly since I dove into your work. And by the way, anyone listening, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, it's probably the book I recommend most to people right now across the board. I mean, um, and all the men that I've been working with in the last few years, this book just continues to reverberate and resound, and I really think that word immensity, that vast, like it just, I feel like there's an entire cavern of vitality, of life, of something inside of me that has been sealed off, that this your work is pointing the way towards.
Well, I like the word vitality there, because so many of our projections onto grief is that it's deadening,
Hmm.
that it's like depression. We equate it with depression,
Right.
and I really want people to hear how
Yeah.
grief is wild. It is feral. It can't be
Hmm.
domesticated. It is so imbued with life force that when you really open to that, you are so alive. Doesn't mean happy, which is our obsession right now,
Mhm,
collectively and
mhm, mhm,
psychologically.
mhm.
But you are alive, fully alive in the dynamic of grief and sorrow and loss. And I want people to begin to trust that. I think
Mhm.
we're so afraid of being taken hostage by grief
Yeah.
that if I go there, I'll never come back. And I often say to people in my practice, if you don't go there, you're never coming back. That some part of us is kind of on hold.
Mm.
We spend so much energy trying to keep that grief out of our hallway. What's that little Denise Levertov poem? To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. So we need to find ways to speak of sorrow,
Mhm.
to bring it out and express it so that my pathway to my soul is not blocked. That's how vital it is.
Yeah.
That's how crucial it is.
So I understand two essential components of grieving, and I'm not sure if I have all the language right, but is containment and release.
Yes.
And I'm exploring containment, right? In terms of, okay, bringing my community together for, let's say, a monthly ritual or just gathering ritual. And this fear comes up for me in the containment. And I think this is one of the reasons why and I think perhaps many, but certainly speaking for myself, why but you've said it a few times. If I go there, I'll never come back. If I open this, it'll go on forever. It'll consume me. There's so much. I think it's like I can instinctively know there's so much there because it's been long ignored that if I go there, uh, you know, you've done 3 day. I'm sure you've done all kinds of different workshops and retreats and practice and everything. 3 days, I get it. I get why 3 days would be a good idea. How do I do that in one evening? How do we close an evening? Like,
Mm.
what happens in just a few hours? How do we do that so we don't send people off? This is the fear that arises in me, the thought that arises in me. How do I help people leave that experience not just drowning in what was brought forth?
It's a good question. I think the amount of defensiveness we have around opening that gate is pretty dense. It took me 3 grief rituals
Mm,
before I shed a single tear.
yeah.
And in 40 years of working with people, I've never seen anybody, never come back.
Mm,
So like I said, grief isn't trying to take us hostage. But
mm,
your comment is a good one, to be cautious
mhm,
because of that bulkhead of defensiveness against our own grief. If we break that open, there's a lot of grief that comes.
mhm,
So we make agreements, like if somebody's in that deep of need, they can call one of the other brothers in your circle, or
mhm,
if it's a multiple gendered group,
mhm,
that we hold each other. You know, uh, but I think an evening of touching the grief really is small enough and tight enough to at least begin to touch it. It's more like we're caressing our grief. 3 days is often what we need to really enter the room of grief.
mm, mhm,
Um, we really are slowly softening our defenses against it. And we give practices, writing practices, movement practices, small group practices.
mhm,
How do we, what we call compost the grief so it's not so hard in us? Now we can access it by the time the grief ritual itself, the ritual proper, is being conducted. Um, I can't think of how many grief rituals I've done. Over 100. Maybe 3 or 4 times in all those rituals did someone go to the place where they needed help coming back. And that's when when we're grieving in a deep way, we're still aware that we're grieving.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? There's a
Yeah.
part of me that notices I am really in deep grief right now. I'm in
Mm-hmm.
it. But there are some times when the grief becomes so strong that you slip over an edge and it becomes what I call grief grieving grief. There's no one witnessing it internally.
Mm.
And that becomes unproductive. It's like you are now uncontained
Mm.
in the relationship you're having with your grief. So we have to go down to the shrine and cool them down. Most of the time we're
Mm-hmm.
trying to warm people up, bring
Right.
more heat, more,
Yeah.
but sometimes we have to bring water down there, put water on their forehead, on the back of their head, on their hands.
Mm.
We get them to sit up and look us in the eye.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see me? Can you feel me?
Mm.
And then we bring them back to the village. They might still keep crying, but there'll be people
Mm.
there with their hands on their shoulders. And we have to monitor that.
Mm-hmm.
And we tell people that before we go into the ritual, that we are keeping a very close eye
Mm.
on what is happening to you.
Mm.
You are being held.
Yeah.
Now you can't let go. So you talk about containment and release. As long as we are doing our own containment, you can't also do the release.
Yeah.
So you become a permanent containment field
Yeah.
for your grief. So we all need spaces where we're held, where the only job I have right now is release. I can express some of this. I can set some of this down. And if we're doing that collectively in a shared way, and particularly if you're doing it repetitively, like once a month, you'll begin to build up that field
Mm-hmm.
and build up the faith. First of all, that grief isn't trying to drown me. It's my lack of faith in grief that is more frightening than the actual encounter with grief.
Yeah.
And then we become kind of mutually responsible for holding that space for each other. See, otherwise you end up being, the container
Mm-hmm.
for all them. And where do you still go with your
Yeah.
grief?
Yeah.
You know, the container needs to be held too sometimes.
Yeah.
I have places where I could take my grief. People ask me that all the time. Well, where do you take yours? Believe me,
Yeah.
I couldn't do this work if I just was holding the space for everybody. I absolutely have places I can be on my knees, letting it roll,
Yeah.
and know that I am being beautifully tended.
Yeah.
That's a good question. How do we communally make sure that everyone in this circle is being witnessed and watched and supported, even beyond the end of the night? You know?
Yeah. Thank you. It's very helpful. I'm both excited and a little terrified of beginning this particular journey direct into sorrow and grief.
Well, again, I would just add that it's a wise uh, fear,
Mm.
because any true ritual space invites the the wild edge of sorrow. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why I call it that. Is that when we really go into deep ritual work with each other, that's what we're inviting in. We're inviting in those parts of us that are kind of seared by grief and
Yeah.
wrecked by grief, and it's a lot of a deep, intense emotion to bring into the field.
Yeah.
So it's good to go in. I go into every ritual kind of, oh shit,
Yeah. Yeah.
here we go,
Yeah.
seatbelt time.
Right.
And,
Right. Yeah.
but also, I guess one maybe other thing to add is that ritual only works in the context of the sacred.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't Bryan holding
Mm.
space.
Mm-hmm.
It's ancestors, it's the
Mm.
land, it's, whatever you want to call that other world. Um, this requires big medicine.
Yeah.
And it isn't, again, about me heroically holding space for everybody, but me in
Right.
collaboration with
Yes.
everything that stands around, behind, under, and above me. It's like, help me do this. Help us do this. Mm.
So I'm aware of time, and I'm very eager to continue this conversation with you again in a future conversation. And I want to just check in with you. Two last things. One is I'm aware that your friend Maladoma Some passed in December.
Yes. Yes.
I don't even know what question I have. It's more of an acknowledgement, and how are you? And were you able to be in community at that time? I mean,
Well, a lot of the people I work with and my village here um, all have worked with melanoma. When
hmm
I was teaching with him on their own, I was really profoundly stunned by his death
mm,
uh, to a degree on which almost surprised me. Um,
mm,
and I began to see how our friendship has affected most every aspect of my life.
mm,
Um, from just the way I work in my practice to
mm,
what I'm teaching to
mhm,
the spaces I hold for people down to the songs that he's taught me.
mm,
And I mean, uh, that was a profound time in my life working with
mm.
him. And I will always, always treasure our friendship and the collaborative things that we created together. And yeah, I miss him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't get to know him personally. I knew him through your writing and sharing, and through Bill Plotkin, also another author, Nature and the Human Soul. I think his book. I also encountered Maladoma, but knowing your friendship with him and his role in that rite of passage, that initiation thing that they did for you. I want you to know that I also I feel the sorrow. I feel both the gratitude and the sorrow that I just can't even imagine you would be holding and sitting in with his passing. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And uh, now he is undoubtedly the one who most taught me about the power and the healing capacity of communal ritual.
Mm,
You know, that I mean, what ritual really looks like. I mean, I was
mm,
raised Catholic, and they call those rituals, but I
mm.
see them more as community ceremonies.
Ceremony.
They're,
Yeah.
they're nice. They're beautiful. They're supportive. They reinforce the community, but they don't give us that
Yeah.
vertical drop
Yeah.
where you are, as I said, deranged and all coordinates are lost and
Mm,
you are rearranged through the process. And
hmm
that was the first place I really, really experienced that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, last question, and this is I know that you have a series of workshops coming up on the five gates of grief.
Yes.
Can you tell us about that? I want to make sure that my listeners know how to access that, and when that's happening.
You can find a link to that on my francisweller.net website. It's being sponsored by the Rose Center in Massachusetts. And I've done several workshops with them, and they're wonderful. I think, given
Yeah.
the givens of our COVID circumstances,
Yep.
I'm beginning to see, that there still is great value in gathering together, even online, and working in small breakout rooms, and there will be very particular practices I will give people for every gate
Mm,
as a way of really dropping deeper into the felt experience of those gates. And then there'll be a place to share that. So then we begin to create a communal sharing around how that worked with the second gate, the reclaiming ritual affected them, or the earth ritual that you'll get. And I mean, we need to begin to kind of, uh, what's the word? bless and uh, come on. Well, just nourish each other's imaginations around what we can do and what we're back to doing, but how we can respond to the
Uh,
presence of these sorrows in our body,
yeah.
uh, and taking them into ritual and imagination and community, because
Yeah.
that's the right context for these things. It always has been, and I think it always will be.
Well, I think, you know, like the doing is I'm going to call my friend and then I'm just going to listen and be with him.
Yeah,
That the doing is just showing up.
yeah, exactly.
I think creating the container for then whatever happens, happens.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I very much look forward to this workshop. I'll be doing everything that I can as well to let people know about it. And um, Francis, as always, the time with you is precious. And I come away from our conversations just renewed and revitalized and grateful. And you know, my wife loves it when I get to talk with you because she feels my she feels the gift of it. So thank you on behalf of my wife and me and my listeners as well. And
Great.
I hope that we can do this again soon.
I know we will. You know.
Beautiful, sir.
All right, Brian.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Be well.